Now, another of our World Fair exhibits that features the audio animatronics is the Carousel Theater of Progress. Well, how do you do? This is the Carousel Theater of Progress. In Act 1, the audience meets an audio animatronic family. The time is just before the turn of the century. Father, the host, tells the joys of living in the pre-electric era. Next, our audience moves to Act 2 and the 1920s. Now the family has all kinds of new contraptions to make life more enjoyable, including a crystal radio. Then our audience moves to the fabulous 40s, the beginning of the electronic era and the age of television. The last act of the Carousel Theater shows the wonderful family life of today with its leisurely push-button living.
Many of you may have heard the news that the beloved attraction, the Carousel of Progress at Walt Disney World, will be completely overhauled and get a massive change. Today, we're going to cover that because it seems to be a little bit of a controversial thing, and I honestly just kind of want to give my statements on it, and honestly, what I think about this, because I've seen a lot of people throw out this whole thing of, what would Walt think about this? Anytime there's a change to any Disney attraction that Walt was around for, it seems like the phrase, what would Walt think about this, or what would Walt do, is thrown out. Whenever the classic attractions that he worked on, or were worked on when he was there, are altered or changed, this is the biggest thing to come. And also, honestly, whenever the parks see a massive change with, IP entering the park, such as the entire Cars Land taking over the rivers of America, that phrase of what would Walt think about this or what would he do is thrown out. And I have some thoughts. I think we all know that Walt was a big proponent of progress. He loved to see progression. I mean, just look at what the original vision of Epcot was. It was a utopian society that he really wanted to make work. And we will make a video on that, just diving into the kind of insanity of that project and how that never ever fully got, realized. But Walt always loved progress. He liked telling stories, and he always liked progressing to the future, which I think is why Tomorrowland is such a successful land, or used to be such a successful land, and was such a very interesting and stylized land when Walt was here. Now, Walt, of course, has talked about how Disneyland will never be finished. It's a constant changing park. He doesn't want it to be an archaic museum, is one of the quotes that he has been quoted with. Now, of course, we love the classics at Disneyland. I'm not going to sit here and advocate for the Haunted Mansion or Pirates of the Caribbean to be completely changed, but I think Walt's quote about the parks being an ever-changing thing is very important to use in the framework of this particular attraction. I've seen a lot of people be a little bummed out about this change, but I've also seen some people defend this change. And although I will say I never got to experience Carousel of Progress, I fully support this change. The Carousel of Progress was originally designed by Walt Disney to serve as a commercial for General Electric and to showcase how electric appliances, benefited American families. It debuted as Progress Land at the 1964 New York World's Fair. And then in 1967, it was introduced at Disneyland. Later, the permanent home at Walt Disney World was introduced in 1975. Now, of course, this attraction has a much deeper history than the one that I gave you right now, but this attraction was created as a commercial at the New York World's Fair. Much like the other commercialized attractions, Walt still made it his own and made it imaginative. The Carousel of Progress that we see today, however, is quite outdated, if we're all being honest with ourselves. Yes, it's an iconic attraction, and I'm sure a lot of people have nostalgia for it, but I think it needs this major facelift. When your show starts looking 60 years in the past, to the dawn of the century, and then going up to the present day, which would be the 1960s for them back then, and looking a little bit toward the future, I think it's time for a major facelift. Now, the current Carousel of Progress, or I guess the new iteration that we're going to be getting, has been described in 4 separate acts. Act 1 will be the 1960s. Act 2 will be the 1980s. And Act 3 will be the new millennium, the 90s and the 2000s and all that fun stuff. But Act 4 will be the possible future. We will be looking toward the future, looking at probably robots and AI, if I imagine correctly. I'm sure that's what they're going to be focusing on. But I think that honestly, this is a good thing that the Disney company is doing. I don't have any problems at all with this being the new way of the Carousel of Progress, just updating it for a modern audience, making sure that we can look forward to the future and also look back on some, somewhat outdated but somewhat relevant inventions. I mean, honestly, the ride and attraction as it is now is quite outdated in my opinion. Of course, it's iconic, but I think the entire focus and the entire idea of Disneyland being an ever changing thing, pushing toward the future, should be echoed here, especially when it's the Carousel of Progress, something to show our progression as a human society and race, and then seeing our progression forward with the inventions that we have created over time. I think that this is the only logical way to redo this attraction is by looking at the past few years from the 60s to present day and then looking toward the future. I think a big complaint that a lot of theme park fans or Disney fans have is how Tomorrowland has not really been updated since like the 90s and early 2000s. It's kind of stuck in a very weird zone and it doesn't really look to the future at all. If we were really playing by what, Walt wanted to do with this park, and especially with Tomorrowland, we would be pushing towards a greater vision in the future constantly. And honestly, Tomorrowland has been needing some major updates. So to see one of the attractions, and one of the biggest attractions, and one of the most iconic attractions, get an actually appropriate adjustment and refurbish and improvement, I honestly think this is great. I'm actually very excited to see what this new version of the Carousel of Progress looks like. And we're actually seeing that the original concept sketches of Disney legend John Hench will be used as drawing inspiration for the finale scene. So we're looking at the original artists who created the original and trying to adapt some of their cool ideas that made the original version so special into this new version. I think it's worth noting that the original song, I think, should be preserved. I know that a lot of the Disney fans, or some of the fans out there, are those people that are like, we need to preserve every single piece and make Disney parks almost as a museum and, treat these all as ancient artifacts and make it a museum. I don't really agree with that. However, the original song and stuff like that, having some of the bones of the original integrated with the new is always a good way of going. So looking at the John Hench, concept art and all of that to draw inspiration for a new version, and of course keeping the Sherman Brothers song, would be delightful. I'm wondering what everybody else here thinks about this change. I know it's a kind of small change and a small news segment here on the channel this week, but it's been a pretty big one. It's been making a lot of commotion, and I kind of just wanted to come on here and remind everybody that yes, Walt's attractions in his time, they should be preserved to a degree. However, his words also said Disneyland and Disney World as an extension, and all the Disney parks really as an extension, should be changing. It'll never be complete. It'll never be finished. You have to keep adding on. Now, I know some people will probably say, well, adding on isn't necessarily meaning overhauling the old stuff. With this one in particular, I think this is a smart and very justified overhaul. As I've already said, Tomorrowland is supposed to be looking to the future, projecting ideas of what could the future be. And with this particular attraction, I think this is like the perfect one. We're looking at, technological advancements throughout time, and we're pushing to see what advancements and inventions will be in the future. Well, honestly, the stuff that they're focusing on in the Carousel of Progress these days, it's a very, very dated thing that we could look in a textbook for. Now, a small part of me kind of wishes that we could maybe condense the original Carousel of Progress into a, smaller portion of this new show, but I think that would just create such a long show and create like a 45-minute attraction. Not saying that long attractions like that haven't existed, because they have. Ellen's Energy was a very, very, very long attraction. And, there's some other long attractions out there too that Disney has done over the years. I'm just saying that this whole new facelift and redesign, I think, is honestly a smart move by the Disney company. Some of these other redesigns or destroying of attractions I don't like, but since this is a sequel to the original and trying to be like a spiritual successor in a way and probably take a lot of the bones of the original into the new, I think that's good. If you keep the original family or as much of it as we can and some of those original animatronics, or maybe if the animatronics aren't used, put them in safe storage and, maybe put them in a museum, I think a lot of fans would be very, very happy. I'm personally very excited to see what kind of things we focus on in each decade. I think that honestly, it'll give a lot of people nostalgia for the times that they grew up in. People that grew up in the 80s and the 90s will have a lot of nostalgia, I'm sure, for this new one and the inventions that they look at that already are, dated, but pave the way towards what we can look to in the future. I'm not saying that all the inventions that they look at in the original Carousel Progress are not paving the way to the future. However, I'm saying that they are severely dated, and I think the show is severely dated, that this is actually a justifiable, upgrade. The inventions that we're going to be looking at in this new show will probably actually lead us to, the technology of robots and such, a more realistic version of that than opposed to what we saw in the 1960s and what people thought the future would look like. I think Tomorrowland needs a major facelift all around. If you look through my videos, I've been a pretty big proponent of Tomorrowland just getting, you know, better upgrades and just better everything. It needs to be and feel more futuristic, looking toward the future. I've been a pretty big proponent of the electric vehicles at Autopia. I've said this for honestly years before this channel, saying that Autopia should be an electric vehicle thing. Once the electric vehicles, started entering mainstream, I said, why doesn't Disney just adopt that? I think that would be the best possible futuristic tone to adapt on this ride. And other rides, of course, as well need some futurism added there and some looking toward the future, because even though Tomorrowland has the fantastical sci-fi elements to it, it also had the historical or somewhat historical, looking back and looking toward the future in a literal way, being like, what's a sort of sci-fi fantasy look at, robots or flying cars, and adding that, but in also a practical way. And a big part of that was, of course, the Carousel of Progress. So I personally think that this is a great addition. I think it'll be an absolute blast, and I think this is just a good stepping stone for a better Tomorrowland. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about this. Do you guys think that this is a total, horrible, horrible move by Disney? Do you guys think it's great? And come back on Sunday for a fully thought out video where we will be covering something big. Peace out and see you in the next.